But Nicole Barger is going to be starting, and she's with the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at University of Colorado at Boulder. And this is kind of a different shift from when I first met Nicole. We were down in the Canyonland country and flying over and looking at distribution, and she's done some really neat work also, as I mentioned earlier, on some of the mesas, looking at age structure and fire history and the impacts or the non-impacts of grazing. So, Nicole?
Thank you, Rick, and I just want to thank you for the invitation and putting the work together to put together such an amazing session so far. It's been a head nodding session for me, where I sit in the audience and I'm like, yeah, I was wondering that too. So this has been great so far. So like Rick said, what I'm going to be talking about today are plant community and soil responses to fuels reduction treatments in upland pinyon juniper woodlands. And I'm going to be talking, my area that I've been working in is the Colorado Plateau. And when I first started working in this area, there's all this like rich literature coming out of the Great Basin area. And I really saw the Colorado Plateau as a potential to contributing to pinyon juniper woodland research. So where I want to start in terms of fuels reduction is this extreme fire year in 2000, when essentially a fuels program was born. And during this time, it was an incredibly big fire year with 7 million acres burned, a lot of money spent in fire suppression efforts. And this really provided, after this point, the legislative framework and funding stream to implement fuels reduction programs within the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service across the country. And so the objectives of the fuels program during that time and currently was to first reduce the risk of catastrophic fire and wildland fire to people, communities, and natural resources. But from an ecological perspective, what I thought was really interesting is that the second objective is to restore forest and rangeland ecosystems to closely match their historical structure, function, diversity, and dynamics. So during this time, I saw this as this incredible opportunity that this large-scale, national-level experiment was going to start. And it was an opportunity from an ecological perspective to ask some really interesting questions. So here what I'm showing is just understanding, so we're working in upland pinyon juniper woodlands. And so what we knew at that point in time is that there are a lot of treatments going on in the higher elevation forests. And there were pretty clear ways to know how to treat ponderosa pine forests, for example. But the issue with pinyon juniper woodlands, and I think what we saw this morning, is that we have fire return intervals that weren't very well understood at that time, but also the indication was that we're in the hundreds of years rather than the 100-year century level. And so the question is whether or not 100 years of fire suppression, fire exclusion activities really was affecting pinyon juniper woodlands, and whether or not these treatments were meeting the goal of restoring them to their historical structure, function, and diversity. So from an ecological perspective, our questions were driven by looking at the potential positive effects of fuels reduction in these in these upland PJ woodlands. So some of the positive effects, of course, are reducing fire risk and enhancing the vegetation structure and composition of the understory. But we were also interested in looking at some of the potential negative effects. So with disturbance and putting fire and mastication and machinery into landscapes, there's a potential pathway for the introduction of exotic species, and also looking at the reduction of vegetation cover and how that may increase soil erosion. So in this system that we were working in the upland pinyon juniper woodlands, I just want to describe very quickly, what they look like. So the plant interspaces in these upland systems. So it's an upland shallow loam Pinyon Juniper Ecological Site. So we heard early on a lot about the ecological sites. So these upland shallow loams, really the average soil depth in these areas is around 20 centimeters. Deep would be 50 centimeters at this site. So bedrock was very close. So in this system, the plant interspaces are often colonized by biological soil crust communities, which are important for stabilizing the soils. And there is very little perennial grass cover, shrub cover in those interspaces. So the hypothesis is that if with soil surface disturbance, we may destabilize these soils and increase soil loss in the system. And again, also we had a hypothesis at this point, at that early point, that the machinery in the system for the mastication could also introduce, that disturbance could be a pathway for the introduction of exotic species. So what I'm going to talk about today is the evaluation of 3 treatment types. So we maintained untreated controls of pinyon juniper. We also looked at mastication. So here what you're seeing is a large like tracked vehicle with a mulching head. And so many of you already know about this, but just to briefly describe it, it mulches into fairly large, coarse, woody material. The pile burn was that there were some very, very small islands of pinyon juniper left at our research site, but most of the pinyon juniper was cut, put into piles that were approximately 6 feet in diameter. They were left to dry for several months and then burned. The lop and scatter, the final treatment that we evaluated, was the removal and cutting of all the trees. They were left to dry for 4 to 5 months, and then there was a broadcast burn put onto the landscape. So you can think of this as 1 mechanical and 2 fire treatments. The way this was chosen is that this was a collaboration with the BLM, the Canyon Country Fire Zone, and this were the most common methods that they were using at this time. So first I'd like to talk about our erosion sampling. So we had 2 types of, once the treatments were completed, 2 types of erosion sampling that we were looking at. So we installed small silt fences that were, our hope was to look at the sediment movement from water erosion. So what we do know is that with these silt fences, we were also capturing a lot of windborne material. And then the samplers for the wind erosion were wind aspirated dust samplers positioned at, and the data I'll be presenting today are just at the 15 centimeter height. Actually, I'm going to go back for a second here. So what I didn't mention is that these were also all seeded. So the original design, and you'll see this today, was that we had seeded and unseeded plots across all of these treatments. So a mistake was made with the seeding, you know, how projects go, that with the fire treatments, actually all got seeded. So when I show you the data, I'll kind of talk you through some of that. All right, so what we're seeing here first are the wind erosion samples, the BS&Es. And as you can see, this is back in 2009. We did some pre-treatment sampling to show that it was wind erosion, or when BS&E samplers were collecting very little material across the treatments. The fire occurred in October of that year, and what we can see by, I'm going to try to use the cursor. Here we go. Between May, that next spring, when the winds are pretty high out in the Moab area, is that we get these huge fluxes of sediment going into our BS&Es in that spring time period. And what we see is that it's those fire treatments. So the highest is the broadcast burn, where probably 70% of the landscape was burned with that broadcast burn. It's second to that is the pile burn, and then the mastication and control are pretty similar to each other. So that across the entire time period in which we sampled, this is what we see in terms of total soil that ended up in these BS&E samplers. So again, this is reflected in what I previously showed, that the control and mastication are similar, and the pile burn and broadcast burn are much higher. So fire treatments were 11 to 28-fold higher than the controls. Okay, so let's move on to the silt fences. So again, the hope with the silt fences is that it's capturing sediment within water erosion, but what we know from the field observation is that we were capturing sediment in kind of water erosion events and runoff events, but we were also capturing some sediments moving in winds just by the structure of the silt fences. So again, it's pretty similar dynamics to what we were seeing with the BS&Es, is that we had the fire. We see a large flux in December of 2009 in terms of large fluxes in the silt fences from the broadcast burn and also the pile burn. So what I also wanted to point out is that we see these, this dynamic holds for about 2 years, and then we start seeing lower fluxes. And this is most likely due to the vegetation recovery. So in the first 2 years, we have a lot of soil moving, both in wind and water erosion. So when we sum all of these across the time period in which we sampled, the fire treatments were 20 to 42-fold higher than the controls. So what we did then, Jeff is actually here right now. He led this study on looking at high-resolution digital aerial imagery. And so what we were able to do is that we've flown these sites before the treatment and then after the treatment. And what this is mapping is, so it's a little hard to see here, but the blue areas are areas of erosion, and the red areas are areas of deposition. So in the most perfect world, all of our treatments wouldn't have been so close to each other, because what you're seeing is that from one wind direction, we're getting some, in that broadcast burn west, we're getting some major wind erosion that is then being deposited in other treatments. But this is just to show that in this high resolution aerial imagery, we're also seeing at the landscape scale exactly what was being picked up on the ground, is that the broadcast burn was having higher levels of erosion relative to the controls and mastication, and there's a similar pattern in the pile burn. And I did have the citation here. I think it just disappeared. So Jeff's here, and I'm here if you need the citation for this paper. So then the question is, why do we see? What explains some of this erosion? Is it just lack of plant cover? Is it the soil stability? So here's the values over time of the soil aggregate stability of across these different treatments. So again, I'm showing control, mastication, pile burn, and broadcast burn. So what we see is 2009 pre-treatment. They're all pretty similar, around a value of 4. In 2010, after the treatment, what we see is that the control, again, is still very similar, and with values around 3.5. But what we start seeing is a soil aggregate stability values in the range of 1 to 2. And what this really means is that around 10% or less of soil is in stable soil aggregates. And so this is just an indicator of what we see is that with that erosion is that these soils have been destabilized during that time. And then by 2011, we see the clear pattern where the control and mastication are pretty similar in their stability relative to the burned areas. So what I'd like to do now is move on to the understory plant responses. So in 2009, what you can see, and this is where I need to talk you through some of these bars. So we have going from left to right, the control seeded and unseeded. The mastication, which didn't have the mistake made, had a seeded and unseeded. And then the broadcast burn and pile burn, where the mistake was made, everything got seeded. So we weren't really able to very clearly look at the effects of seeding because of this. But so let's start with 2009 pretreatment. So understory plant cover is pretty low in this area and similar across the sites. 2010, after the treatment, there's not very much response in that first growing season. For those of you that are in the restoration world, it's probably not that surprising. By 2011, 2 years after treatment, we've gotten a bit of a response, but and some of the treatments, there's no clear treatment differences. But what I really want to point out here, and I think is critical for all of us that are on 4 to 5 year funding cycles, and sometimes less, is that our answers in the first 2 years after we do some of these treatments may be very different 6 years later. So we went back and looked at these areas in 2016, 6 years after treatment, and what we saw was this treatment response in the mastication that was higher than, and this is just understory plant cover. So if you look at that mastication bar, we're getting a nice response, but I want you to hold on to that in your mind as I go to the next slide. So that part of that response 6 years later was cheatgrass that was coming into the mastication. So the reason that, again, if you look at the pretreatment, there is not a lot of cheatgrass cover in these sites. And by 2015, we're getting values in the mastication about 25% cheatgrass cover. And what's interesting, so again, you can't even see the 2 control bars in 2015 because there's not cheatgrass there. So what's interesting here is that we can look a little bit on the effect of seeding. That high level of cheatgrass is in the mastication unseeded. If you look to the bar to the left, that's the mastication seeded. And so what we're seeing is that there is an effect of seeding and spending that money on the seed in that mastication site. And I'm going to, since I'm running a little bit low on time, I just wanted to show the seed mix responses. So this is just what was in the seed mix and what kind of cover that we were getting after 6 years. So again, the only reason that we were able to go back in year 6 was our collaboration and continuing collaboration with the BLM, that they were able to get us the money to continue this monitoring outside of our grant funding cycle. So I want to close with some restoration challenges, is that first, there are some clear soil responses to those fuels reduction strategies. And it's a lot of work and it's pretty difficult to monitor, but it's pretty critical to soil and site stability. And so if you wanted to monitor your potential for destabilizing soils, probably the best thing to do is to be looking at and measuring soil stability through field slake tests. And also the plant community responses, and I think we all know this, and those of us that work in restoration, is that we can start seeing responses 6 to 7 years. And my encouragement is to really be thinking about how universities and federal scientists and the agencies can be leveraging all of our resources to be able to keep monitoring some of these areas. And so that's what we're doing now, is that the BLM is giving us $25,000 a year to continue to monitor these areas over the long term. So any of you working in the agencies, I would say find an academic and make them your friend, because we can do a lot of monitoring, and we can do a lot of monitoring with undergraduates that need jobs, and they're fairly inexpensive. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the undergraduates that did all of this work, and also acknowledge the Canyon Country Fire Zone, who were critical in this collaboration and continue to be over the longer term. Thank you, and I'll tell you, I have some time to take questions. Where to start? Right here. Yeah. That's a real, so the question is, before we treated in 2009, what was the clearly cheatgrass is there and the population is there. What was it like before that? So the answer is that we had not worked in these sites before that time. We don't really know, but from doing all the site reconnaissance, what I do know is that 1 to 2% level is that what we would see is maybe some evidence of some disturbance, and there would be these small populations just sitting there. And also, oftentimes they'll sit under the pinyon juniper trees, if anyone has seen that. And so what I think is happening is that the fire and the removal is, and the mastication is providing an opportunities for those populations to get in. And I also want to say that 2015 was also a very wet year at that, and so it's like it was the best case scenario for cheatgrass that year also. Yes.
We got to move on.
Okay.